We may have a better life, but we're not going to be completely free from whatever struggle it is if we don't have a spiritual connection and involve God in all these different things. Many times we get focused so much on what everybody has done to us, and we forget about that the other side of that equation is that we have harmed people along the way. We begin to trust that no matter what we walk through, no matter what the ramifications are, that He can get us through it in whatever situation. God wants to dwell with us. He wants to be our God, and that's the beautiful picture of what we got to see with Jesus come to earth. Every one of us has had that time in our life when we needed to say, I'm sorry to somebody, haven't we? And if you may be familiar with the old Elton John song, sorry seems to be the hardest word. It's still the hardest word. As old as that song is, sorry can be the hardest thing that we ever say. And we can get this mind game going on, or at least I can. Maybe you can relate that, when we realize that, maybe we're well into our recovery or healing process, and then we realize there's people that we've harmed along the way, because recovery is never just about ourselves. The healing process is about a lot of other people, just us. It's never just about us. And we reach that point when we realize there's somebody that, we may have harmed. And going to them and saying, I'm sorry, is a very, very hard thing to do. And many times I would rationalize it away, and it would be like, well, it really wasn't that big a deal. It's something that they probably don't even think anything of. And if you've heard me teach for very long, you've heard me give a whole lot of examples about people that I have gone back to and tried to make amends to and apologize for things I've done. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're still in this series of 12 steps, climbing the ladder of recovery, and we're going to be talking about making amends, the hardest word. That's the title of this teaching as we go through this tonight. And I hope that if you've been following along, if you've been coming or you're listening to this on audio somewhere online or in your car or whatever, that you have been keeping up and that you are all in with all these previous steps. I'm not going to go in and recap all these teachings that we've gone through, but basically I just want to remind us that, we made a commitment that we wanted to do whatever was required for us to get out of this struggle that we're going through. And we saw this huge ladder that we have on here on the stage, and it's 12 steps tall, and it's really tall, and then short ladders, medium ladders, and all these different things, and how maybe if we've really seriously gone through this process, and when we thought that was this huge process we were going to go through, this huge ladder that we had to climb, and now we're maybe halfway up on it. We're five weeks into this teaching, and we're making progress, and hopefully things are beginning to feel a little better, and we're seeing that maybe there is hope. Maybe there is light at the end of that tunnel, and maybe there is a different way from whatever addiction that I've had in my past. And so tonight we're talking about Steps 8 and 9, and just remind us, I'm going to read some stuff here from the big book from Alcoholics Anonymous. And you may be thinking, well, this is a faith-based program, and why are you going back and talking about the big book, and why aren't you talking from the Bible, and putting the Bible to the 12 steps? And we're doing both. And to me, it's been very fascinating to see these writers that we've talked about every week and went back and quoted, and see how they'd established this idea that outside of some kind of spiritual experience, that we just are not going to get better. We may have a better life, but we're not going to be completely free from whatever struggle it is if we don't have a spiritual connection and involve God in all these different things. And so we've talked about how God can set us free immediately, and we can, just be like taking a magic pill, and that happens to some people, and all of a sudden I'm free from all this. But then others, we need that process to walk through these things. And we get God at the very beginning of it, and then we learn to begin to lean into Him for all these different things, and then we begin to live our life with God at the front. And so I want to read you how they go into these two steps. And they say, we need more action, without which we find that faith without works is dead. And that's interesting. I put a note below that paragraph there that if you look in the Bible, this letter that James wrote, the brother of Jesus, that's the exact phrase that James, the brother of Jesus, used when he wrote this letter. And it's in James chapter 2, verse 20, page 1602 in the Life Recovery Bible. And he said that we find that faith without works is dead. Let's look at steps 8 and 9. We have a list of all persons we have harmed and to whom we are willing to make amends. We made that list when we took inventory. We subjected ourselves to a drastic self-appraisal. Now we go out to our fellows and repair the damage done in the past. We attempt to sweep away the debris which has accumulated out of our effort to live on self-will and run the show ourselves. If we haven't the will to do this, then we ask until it comes. Remember, it was agreed at the beginning that we would go to any lengths for victory over alcohol, or as we've said, whatever struggle that we may be having, because there's all these different anonymous groups now that are based on these same 12 steps, whether it's no matter what our struggle is. And so steps 8 and 9 says this. We made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. We made direct amends to such people whenever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. And they made reference there that, that we already had this list because we went back and doing this personal inventory, and we realized that there were all of these people, this group of people or institutions or all these different things that brought harm to us. And in that process, we brought things to the surface, hopefully, where we realized that, I've harmed people too. This is not a one-sided affair. And I would say that, it's probably relevant to all of us that, even though we were the one with the addiction and we think that, we were the one that was hurt, that many times we get focused so much on what everybody has done to us, and we forget about that the other side of that equation is that we have harmed people along the way. And so this is a point, like we talked about cleaning house, where we got all that stuff together, and this is part of like taking out the trash. This is where we begin to go to some of these people and we begin to say, I'm sorry. And that hard word that it is to say. They went on to say, our man is sure to be impressed with a sincere desire to set the wrong. He is going to be more interested in a demonstration of goodwill than in our talk of spiritual discoveries. And so it's interesting that, when we go to these people, and probably just since I've mentioned this, I've already had somebody say to me, I know somebody that I need to go make amends with, and I've just been putting it off. And there probably are already one or more people that we know that we need to make amends to, that in some fashion or another, that we need to say, I'm sorry, that I'm not the same person that I was when I did this, and I'm a different person. And they make the point here that, we don't need to go to them from a standpoint of like all of a sudden now, I'm this huge spiritual person, or I want you to know that, I've got the God thing and I'm a Christian and all is better. Because that's probably not always the right approach, because they've been harmed. They have been wounded at our expense. And for us to come and what would seem like maybe to them and excuse it away saying, oh, I've got God now and I want to ask you to forgive me, and you're obligated to say yes. That's probably not the right approach to it. More than likely, and if you read in detail what they talked about there, they really nailed it very well, that you want to build more of a camaraderie with this person if possible. Not that, if there's relationships there that you don't necessarily won't become lifetime friends in many cases, but you at least want to come with a humble heart. And that's a hard thing for us to do, and just say, we've realized in whatever capacity that this was wrong, what I've done to you. And, later on, they may ask the question to us, well, what is it that changed? What made you change? And then we get the opportunity to say, look, I've had this spiritual experience. I've found God. I've found Jesus, and I've changed my life, and I've begun to follow him, and he has made everything different in my life, and I want to go back and make amends to every person that I've harmed. And so we still may have that opportunity, but we don't want to minimize it in their sight, maybe just playing the religion card, we could say. It says we go to him in a helpful, forgiving spirit, confessing our former ill feeling and expressing our regret. And you may be thinking, who are these people? Who would I go to? Well, a lot of us, like I said, I'm sure we already know who some of them are. For me, I knew people I had harmed. And I've told you time and time again about business acquaintances. That was one of the first ones that they listed in that chapter. People that I had stepped on along the way in my climb to want to be a successful person, and I'd brought harm to people. And so there may be many of us that immediately it comes to mind. And I would say that, again, it's easy to want to excuse and say, well, I'll never be doing business with them again, or I'll never come in contact with them again. But at least we need to begin to make a list. And I promise you this, that if we have a list of people that we believe that God has brought to mind that we have harmed, then at some point in our life, in our travels, we are probably going to come in contact with these people. And so it could be business acquaintances, it could be friends. I mean, you know of friends. I mean, you've heard stories of people who had been lifetime friends, and then all of a sudden something happened. And the whole lifetime of friendship thing, as you would hear it, has just been thrown to the side, thrown away. And so a whole friendship has been thrown away because someone wasn't big enough to come back and do the spiritual thing we're talking about here and say, look, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I've done. And so there's friends, enemies, creditors. Think about that. I hear this all the time, and I have been part of this process. I mean, we accumulate debt, and then we just throw it away and say, we'll file bankruptcy. And I know there's all kind of different reasons. I'm not making any judgments on people because I've been there myself. And then we have some debt that we just avoid the mail long enough when the bills come due that eventually it just goes away. And we avoid the letters from the credit reporting agencies, and eventually it goes away. I've been there. I've been in that category. And we simply just let those things go, that we let it go over time, that eventually this will go away. What's it going to hurt them? I mean, they have ways they can deal with it. They'll count it as a loss, and they'll show it as a loss. And so, you know, I remember seeing a Seinfeld show one time, and they talked about something that went haywire in the mail, and a stereo had got torn up or something, and one of the characters had said, yeah, they'll just file it as a loss. And then there was this big discussion, well, what does that mean? What is a loss? You know, somebody still lost at the expense of how they had been harmed, whether it was us doing that to a creditor or a person, individual, or whatever. But money is a lot of times involved in that. And I've shared with you time and again how I had, you know, $60,000 to $80,000 in medical debt that I wanted to excuse away. But as a process of coming to this spiritual connection with God and beginning to live for Him, I really felt like that bankruptcy was not the thing for me to do. And a lot of people advised me of that because of the medical debt. But, you know, I felt like God was saying, no, these people saved your life, and you really need to pay them for what they have done for you. And I have, and I'm still paying on that, and had made a comment to Clarissa, you know, just months ago that, look, I'll probably be paying on this the rest of my life, but I made a commitment to pay for that because it was my responsibility, and I didn't want to leave them holding the bag. Legal authorities or criminal offenses. And this one, they spent a lot of time talking about this, and you could imagine that this could be a very difficult thing. And I don't have this hanging over me. I don't have anything like that, but there may be people who have committed criminal offenses, and they never did admit them, and they got away with it. And so, you know, there's a fine line in there where we possibly should go to authorities and admit, look, I did something years and years ago, and this is the deal, and I want to come clean for it. All these different things, and I'm in communication with a lot of people who are in jail and out of jail, and one of the people that I have a high regard for is the guy that is the leader at the branch house, and a lot of you know him. And he comes here and he serves and he participates, and he actually was the person who gave the name for Branch House while he was incarcerated. And he had done some time down in Georgia, and speaking of saying I'm sorry or making amends, doing the right thing, he had called me from Georgia, and he still was supposed to do time here in Tennessee. And he could have stayed down there and been fine because Georgia had already told him, we're not going to come and get you. Because the offense was, you know, not major. He's not a murderer or anything like that. It had to do with his addiction, alcoholism. And so we're not going to come and get you, but you should come and turn yourself in. And his family lives in Georgia, and he's been there most all of his life. And so he asked me, he said, I would like to know if you'd come down and pick me up, and I want to come back to Blountville and turn myself in and do my time. And so weeks later, I went and got him, and I brought him, and he stayed a few nights at our home. He worked a few days at the branch house, and then I took him over, and he turned himself in. And he ended up doing the rest of his time, finishing out his sentence, flattening his sentence, as it called. And he ended up spending more time than he thought. And because of the system, he actually spent more time than he was supposed to be there because they messed up on his paperwork by about 2 months, actually. And so he knew that because of his spiritual connection to God, that he needed to come back and do the right thing and say, I was wrong and I'm turning myself in. And so he did that. And he had several opportunities to actually even opt out of it, because if he wanted to live within the flesh and just get away with it, because he called him the one day that we were going to take him over there, and he said, I need to turn myself in because I violated my probation. And they said, well, we can't take you. And so he could have just gone away, but he persisted and he stayed a few more days, and he went ahead and turned himself in. And so that happens to a lot of us, and there may be legal things that we need to deal with. And see, this is a tough teaching, because probably anybody that's hearing this, through one of these points, you're going to hear and you're going to be like, oh, there's that person. There's that thing that I need to deal with. And whoever it is, whatever it is, we need to at least make note of that and be prepared to let God walk us through that when the opportunity presents itself, or as he nudges us to take care of it. And then there's a former spouse that we may have abused, alimony, child support, or all these other things. This is another huge thing, because it's so rampant in this day and time of people that will not pay their child support to support children that we have brought into the family. And that's extremely important, and people get away with that. And so, see, that's something that is very serious when we go back and look at these things that we have to deal with. And again, I say this is a very tough teaching, because a lot of these things, they involve finances. A lot of them could involve ramifications. And see, there could be this pivotal point here that we need to be careful with, that we could get angry with God and say, well, now I'm trying to do the God thing and I have to do all of this stuff. And see, that could make us want to just throw in the towel, and we say the God thing didn't work for me, or that I just can't believe that God would make me do this. And we have to pause there if that's what we may be feeling or hearing, because, see, God is not making us do this. These are consequences for our actions that had nothing to do with God. And because of our spiritual connection to God now, then he is gently saying, let's walk through this together. And we begin to trust that no matter what we walk through, no matter what the ramifications are, that he can get us through it in whatever situation. And so it can be very hard to just skip over and walk away from this, but I would challenge us to believe the idea that unless we really buy in and believe this and pursue this, that we will never have true and lasting peace. There will be that one thing or two or three or whatever down there in our gut that we just need to deal with. And I would say, to you, that there are a lot of people that I've gone to, and actually there's only probably 2 people that I've gone to, and I've gone to a lot of people that didn't really accept my apology. And it caught me off guard, and I could just tell you story after story, and I'm not going to get into those, but I've gone to business people, I've gone to family, I've gone to my children, I've gone to former bosses, I've gone to former people that did work for me. I've gone to a lot of different people and made apologies and tried to make amends in whatever capacity that I could. And so then, all of these things, going along with what they said there in that one step, when it comes to many of these, like he said in step 9, that except when to do so would injure them or others. It's important that we use wisdom here, that, we don't just launch into this whole idea of, I have this list and I need to check it off, and I've called them, bam, 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 and my list is done. And I really don't believe that that's the way that God would orchestrate this, because for many of us, we can call them, and we can sit down with them, or we will run into them. They may be in our circle of people or our circle of community, and a lot of people may not, but God will bring them. But timing is everything. And I say this to people a lot when I'm trying to talk with them about how to go about this. I know, like with some of my family, my mother, for instance, it was more than a year or more before I ever had the right opportunity to go and talk to her and apologize for some of the things that I had done and have that long conversation. And there was this time that I actually did try to force it and just check the box, and it just totally self-destructed. And I learned a valuable lesson for that. So we watch for those opportunities, and then we take them promptly whenever they come to mind. And then there could be our current spouse and family that we've brought harm to, and that we seek to make amends in whatever fashion that is. And you see that a whole lot, whenever we have people share their life story and they've been through something that really harmed their wife, either sexually or with money or all these different things, being an alcoholic or drug addict for years and years and years. And then the family has stayed united because the spouse was willing to buy in and say, okay, let's see if God can work this out. And when you hear these powerful stories, you hear how they've had to go back and totally, you just hear the humility in their heart of how they fell before their spouse and made apology. And it takes time for the healing, but the willing heart of being able to go forward and do that is just powerful. And there's a lot of you in the room, and a lot of you that I could point out, and you could come up here and you could just tell stories of how I made amends in this way to my spouse. And probably you could tell us stories of how you went about it the wrong way, and then you got the right way, and then there's other times that you keep going back. And I would add that, for some people that we are very close to, that's in our circle of people, that it may not just be one time. There may be things that God brings to our mind time and time again as we continue on this path, but it's so important that we keep our slate clean. We'll talk next week a little about that. When Jesus, he gave this whole idea that, if you're at the altar, talking about the church they had there, and you think of something, you need to leave and go deal with it. And I did a whole teaching on that, and we'll talk a little more about it next week. But see, Jesus, our spiritual leader, he carried that whole idea that you need to walk with a clean slate. And if you realize that there's something you have against somebody or something they've had against you, that you need to go to them and talk to them. And so current family members are ones that we need to talk to and as well. And like I said, I've gone to both of my children, my natural children, and apologized to them for things that I had done to them. And I've done it more than once. Because sometimes I think, the multitude of things that I felt like I did bringing harm to my family can't be said in just one setting. And many of them, I may have said the same thing or apologized for the same thing when it seemed repetitive, but it's sometimes such a shock when we go to somebody that I'm not sure they can fully hear and grasp that we are truly saying, I'm sorry. And so I've gone back several times, especially with my children, to make sure that they know how sorry I am for the harm that I brought to them in its various forms and fashion as they were growing up because of my addiction and all the struggles that I had. And then the medical debt I talked about, and the children I talked about. And you would have other people or other institutions as well that you may put on here. This is not a complete list, but I would challenge us to who are those? And God will bring them to mind. Like we said last week, the psalmist wrote, search me and know me. And he will bring those things to mind, God will, of who we need to go to. And then they went on to write in the big book, they said, reminding ourselves that we have decided to go to any lengths to find a spiritual experience, we ask that we be given strength and direction to do the right thing no matter what the personal consequences may be. And it's important that we recognize here, and you've probably heard this theme in the previous teachings where I quoted from there, but they have these two recurring themes in the big book that I thought was just really interesting, that they keep talking about taking action. And they keep talking about remember what you decided in the beginning. And so sometimes I think, that's where we get lost, is we get to that point to where we just forget that we made this decision, that we were following God. We forget that, like some of the other steps talked about, that we were turning our entire life and our will over to Him. And so then we take it back. We forget that we said to family or friends or employers that I'm going to do whatever I have to do to be free from this struggle or this addiction in my life. And we forget that. And so they consistently are reminding the reader to remember what you decided to do. Remember that you said no matter what you had to go through, you were going to do whatever to get free, totally free from this struggle that you're having. And remember that it takes action on our part. And even though we have this spiritual connection, God will gently nudge us. We have to take the action to walk forward in whatever step or action it is that He is wanting us to take. And they had this one paragraph in there. It said they gave this a this picture analogy. The alcoholic or whatever our struggle is like a tornado roaring his way through the lives of others. Hearts are broken. Sweet relationships are dead. Affections have been uprooted. Selfish and inconsiderate habits have kept the home in turmoil. We feel a man is unthinking when he says that sobriety is enough. He is like the farmer who came up out of his cyclone cellar to find his home ruined. To his wife he remarked, "Don't see anything the matter here, Ma. Ain't it grand the wind stopped blowing?" Yes, there's a long period of reconstruction ahead. We must take the lead. A remorseful mumbling that we are sorry won't fill the bill at all. We ought to sit down with the family and frankly analyze the past as we now see it, being very careful not to criticize them. So see, that whole thing about, just thinking sobriety is enough. And I think, we've talked about that, how, restoring our mind to sanity, how we may be falsely believing that just, if I can just be free from this addiction, then that is sanity. If I can just have some sobriety and have 5 years under my belt or 10 years under my belt or 2 years or 3 weeks, that's enough. But that is not enough to bring us to a point of freedom to where our life is totally transformed from what it used to be to what it is now. And so then I want to talk about this story that Jesus had. It's documented. I believe I got this from Luke. And it's from page 1324 in the Life Recovery Bible, or Luke chapter 19 if you want to follow along. But there was this guy named Zacchaeus. And there's this great picture of making amends. Because, see, Zacchaeus, he was a tax collector. And, from the standpoint of that time, tax collectors were some of the worst. I mean, they were two categories that the religious people said, tax collectors and sinners. And one was as bad as the other, and I think tax collectors was probably even worse. It wasn't just that you're a sinner. It wasn't just that you had this issue, but you were in a category by yourself. You were a tax collector. And so this guy, Zacchaeus, he was not just a tax collector. He was the chief tax collector. And so there came this point when Jesus was coming through town, and apparently Zacchaeus was a short man, and because of the crowd, he couldn't see him. And so he climbed up in that sycamore tree, which, we sung songs about when we were small, and learned that whole thing, that he climbed up in the sycamore tree because it was the Lord he wanted to see. And he saw Jesus. And look what happened here as this whole thing begins to unfold. When Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacchaeus and called him by name. "Zacchaeus," he said, "quick, come down. I must be a guest in your home today." And Zacchaeus quickly climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. But the people were displeased. He has gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner, they grumbled. And so meanwhile, Zacchaeus stood before the Lord and he said, "I will give half of my wealth to the poor, Lord, and if I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much." And Jesus responded, "Salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost." Now see, there's several interesting things about this story. I mean, Zacchaeus, he was up in the tree, and yet we don't have any record that he said, "Hey, Jesus, what's going on? I want to have you over to the house for lunch," or whatever. It said Jesus called to him. And he called him by name. And see, if you read through the Gospels and the life of Jesus, I mean, for many of us that have struggled with this whole idea that, God is far away and only the super spiritual people can talk to him. I mean, you see Jesus coming in contact with all kind of people. I mean, he spoke to the woman at the well, the lepers, the tax collectors, the common folk, all these different people. And so Jesus called him by name. He knew that, this is one of the worst. He could have picked me if he were in this crowd today, and he's like, "Look, yeah, Roger, you, because I had as much bad stuff maybe as Zacchaeus does. I don't know, and maybe you did too." And you've heard me talk about how I thought, God was unapproachable, but it's important for us to realize that Jesus called him by name. And he asked him to come down, and he wanted to go to his house. He didn't want to just give a speech and sermon that, he would take home and leave and take his notes and study later. He wanted to go to his house. See, God wants to dwell with us. He wants to be our God. And that's the beautiful picture of what we got to see with Jesus come to earth. We got to see that God wants to dwell with us. Remember, his name was called Emmanuel, God with us. Jesus wants to spend time with us. He wants to communicate with us through his Holy Spirit. And, he's not this big God standing with a big hammer that wants to squash us like an ant. And so then, anyway, he went on to his house, and we know that the people grumbled. And then, with no prompting of what happened here or whatever, then we see that Zacchaeus made this great two-part statement. And talking about saying I'm sorry and making amends, this is interesting. I mean, and he may have known some of the law that was back in the books that they had, the Deuteronomy and all those type things where some of the law, he may have heard some of that. I'm not sure because it doesn't tell us. But look at what he said. After he had this experience with Jesus, I mean, he had a God experience moment, and Jesus was there now dwelling with him. And he said, I will give half of my wealth to the poor, Lord. And see, that standalone statement, that's not any amends. He gets to that next. He said, and if I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much. So see, we've talked about this comment being all in. He was all in. I mean, he decided right off the bat, the first thing he said is, I'm going to give this much money to the poor. Then he said, if I've cheated people, i.e. I need to make amends, I'm going to go give them 4 times as much. So he was not just going to, take the shortcut and say, if I've cheated anybody, I'm going to make amends. He went way beyond that, and he said, I'll give half of my wealth to the poor. And see, that's contrasting because, we know a lot of other stories from when Jesus was here, like the rich ruler we talked about, where, Jesus said to him, well, hey, give everything up and follow me. And he wasn't willing to do it. And so unannounced, he just stands up and says to the Lord, I'm going to give half of this to the poor, and then I'm going to go do these other things. So see, God, whenever he takes control of our life, when we have this spiritual experience, they're just so much better that we're not holding on to these things that have kept us in bondage for so many years. There's this sense of freedom in this Zacchaeus guy that like now, none of this really matters. I mean, obviously he still needed to eat. And, Jesus didn't say to him, well, hey, you're giving half, you should just go ahead and give the other half. But he made the comment that truly salvation, truly deliverance had come to that house today is what that meant, because his whole heart change was, no matter what I've got, I'm going to pay people back and I'm going to give as much as I can give to other people. So he was all in that one encounter with Jesus. And then that's, as far as I know, that's all we ever hear about Zacchaeus anymore. But that's a great example of making amends. He was taking action, you could say. And I wonder, you remember early in Matthew and he wrote one of the other accounts of Jesus' life, and he was a tax collector as well. And he was one of the disciples that came, Jesus came by and he's like, look, just follow me. And Matthew, a tax collector, got up and followed him. And then he also had Jesus in his house, and there were a lot of other tax collectors and people there as well. And then the religious people grumbled about that. And I wonder if Zacchaeus may have been one of those people that had kind of encountered Jesus at that home gathering of Matthew. I mean, we don't know. I mean, the accounts we have, they don't say that he was the one, but, like people stay together, I mean, hey, get all your tax collector buddies. Hey, get all your construction buddies. Hey, get all your musician buddies. And Jesus is coming over. He may have been there. I don't know. And he may have heard that message, and then he got up to pursue more about Jesus. And like I said, we don't know. The Gospels don't tell us, but that just kind of struck me as I wondered if they were in that same community in town, and maybe he had heard about Jesus through some of his buddies. And then there may be some amends that are not possible. And those may come to mind. And I made a comment here that, maybe, and when I say there's some amends that are not possible, like, when I started doing my list, when I got into the healing process and I realized that there were people that I had harmed and people that had harmed me. My dad had been dead for probably 20 years. And so I wrote a letter. And I mean, you hear this often. I mean, it's not any new idea. But I mean, we can write a letter to people. And I mean, I took it to his grave and I read it. And I wrote down a lot of things that I needed to say to him that I never got to say, apologize for things. And that was very helpful to me. And then I threw the letter away. And see, that's important that we do that because it kind of documents things. And you know, there was this thing we talked about that we see throughout Scripture where, you know, people made these stones of remembrance, and we've talked about that. But when I wrote that on paper and apologized to those things, and I'd done that to several people as well, and one person I knew that I really couldn't go see, but I wrote him a letter. I knew it wouldn't be the right thing to do to go see him, and so I wrote him a letter, and I actually mailed it to him. And I got a positive response from that. And so there's a lot of different ways that we can make amends to people. But if there are people that we may not even know, like we may be angry at a father that we never knew. And you know, that may be part of our stuff that we're going back and writing letters for, just for people that have harmed us. And then there may be those that we need to make amends to, and we have no idea how to get in touch with them. But if it's on our mind, we should at least journal it, write it down, share it with a friend, and that way, you know, I've always found this one principle that as I've been walking this spiritual path, and I would go back to somebody and I would practice this principle, and no matter what the response was, that, you know, they were on my mind, and then I go back to them and I apologize and tell them I'm not the person I used to be, and then I leave that situation, then they don't come back to mind anymore, not in a negative sense. I mean, there for a while it may have been they were right there. They were right there in the front of my mind. But as I began to talk to these people, those things went away because that had settled that issue and it was done as far as I was concerned on my part. And, you know, like I said, there may be times that we need to go back and do it several times depending on the situation. So I challenge you to think about all those. This can be a very overwhelming process to go through. And again, I would remind us that community. I mean, Zacchaeus, you know, there were people there probably, and he said that in front of them. And so community is very important, that we're surrounded by community. And you have your small groups and hopefully other people you stay in communication with throughout the week. But it's important that we talk these things through. And so as they come toward the end of these steps in the big book, they begin to wrap it up when they called this the promises. And if you're a AA, NA, SA person, all those, you're probably very familiar with this. But this is really, really good. Let's look at what they said. If we are painstaking about this phase of our development, we will be amazed before we are halfway through. We're going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. We will not regret the past, nor wish to shut the door on it. We will comprehend the word serenity, and we will know peace. No matter how far down the scale we have gone, we will see how our experience can benefit others. That feeling of uselessness and self-pity will disappear. We will lose interest in selfish things and gain interest in our fellows. Self-seeking will slip away. Our whole attitude and outlook upon life will change. Fear of people and of economic insecurity will leave us. We will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. We will suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. Are these extravagant promises? We think not. They are being fulfilled among us, sometimes quickly and sometimes slowly. They will always materialize if we work for them. And see, that's powerful stuff right there. He made a statement that we will not regret the past, nor wish to shut the door on it. And why is that important? I mean, because many of us, you know, we say, I just want to put all that past behind me. I don't want to bring any of that stuff up. But see, what they're saying here is they're not afraid of their past anymore. All of that stuff God has brought healing to through this spiritual experience. And not only am I not afraid of it anymore, I don't care to not shut the door on it because I can share that with someone else, which we'll get to in one of their latter steps. But see, God will use those things as an opportunity to say, look at what I used to be, and look at how God has brought me through all this. Look at all these same pains that I can relate to that are very similar to what you're going through. And God will use all those different things. And we realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. And see, I would say, that we need to realize that even though we've gone on this spiritual journey and we're trusting God, and there may be somebody that's listening to this and you're not into the whole God thing yet, every one of these things that we've talked about up to this point, they're universal principles. It's just that I believe that, without God, we can't be fully free. But these are universal principles that would probably have to improve our life some. And I just think if you add the spiritual thing to it, God, that it just bursts everything wide open, and that we become so much more healthy. We become into the person that we never even realized that we used to be. And so then freedom points, things to talk about with your group, your sponsor, your mentors. God works through our weaknesses. They said there that, God was doing for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. Some of these things are very hard. We feel like we just don't have the strength to do them. Well, look at what the writer of Corinthians, Paul, what he said, and we're familiar with this. My grace is all you need. He had this struggle going on, and yet God was encouraging him, saying, look, my grace is enough. We can get through this. My power works best in your weakness. And so then, that's on page 1493 in your Life Recovery Bible, or 2 Corinthians 12. And he went on to say, now I'm glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. And then he went on to say in another letter he wrote to the Philippians, he said, I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. That's in Philippians 4:13 and page 1526. And he went on to say, even so, you have done well to share with me in my present difficulty. And, you hear that verse a lot that says, I can do all things through Christ. And as I was reading that, I'm like, that's true. I'm glad that I have the God factor now to help me be able to do these things that I really am not self-equipped to do on my own. But then when I saw that next verse, it tends to be left off, but it goes right along with what we've been talking about when he said to them, even so, you have done well to share with me in my present difficulty. What is that? I can do all things with Christ, but thank you for helping me as a community. Thank you that even though I can do all things with Christ, thank you that you are shoring me up and helping me through these tough times. And so what do we do with all this? Walking it out as you talk about this in your group. Make a decision to begin making amends as God leads you, remembering that time is everything. Begin with the obvious. What is that one thing, that one, two, or three people that may have just caught in your mind, right in your gut, that you're like, oh, I didn't want to hear this teaching, that you just know they're right there at the front. Write that down and express to your group or your accountability person or sponsor, mentor, that I need to make amends with this person. Get that spoke out loud. Thank God for what he's been doing in your life through this entire process. And stay connected to community, as we talked about in Philippians there. Stay connected. We can do all things through Christ, but we're designed to function as community so that we get encouraged and that we encourage along the way. And then I want to point out to you this other handout that you probably have. It's called Ending the Cycle of Relational Distance and Failures, Practicing the Ministry of Restitution. This is from a ministry called Shiloh Place Ministry. And they're in North Carolina. The founder of this ministry, Jack Frost, he's dead now. And I came on to this several years ago, and a long time ago I did an entire teaching on this, but this is powerful. And it's so powerful with regards to this step that I'm not going to go through it, because there's too much to cover. There's 2 pages here, and for those of you who are listening and you're not here for the live teaching, I'll put a link to this in the handout and a link to it on our website. You can go to there, celebratingfreedom.org, and take a look at it. But he goes through all these different things of selfishness. He goes through all these different things about how he makes one comment here that's always stuck to me, that like, if the other person was 95% right and we were only 5% wrong, we have a responsibility to take care of that 5%. And see, there's that thing I was saying earlier where we like to rationalize and say, it really wasn't that big a deal. It might have been a big deal to them, but in any case, if it's partly something we did, we need to go ahead and make amends and restitution for it. And you can find this at shallowplace.org under their free downloads, and I will put a link to it on the website. But it's a powerful tool that you can read through and talk about. And as you go through in this process, he even lays out a step process of how you can go through there and do it. I think he gives about 4 different bullet points. And so next week, we're going to finish up this series. We're going to talk about steps 10, 11, and 12. That might seem like a lot, but really the way it's laid out, they all go together. So we will finish up this series next week. And I want to say to you, all of us, that, I mean, if you've been listening to this and you're like, okay, I'm on teaching number 5, and I really didn't fully do that step 2, 3, 4, or whatever, don't be discouraged. Go back and pick up where you were and do this as completely as God is nudging you along. There's nothing wrong with saying, I've got stuff there I need to go back and deal with. I mean, it's taken me years to learn all the different things that God has wanted to work out in me, and it has not been a bad thing. See, God, He doesn't, I don't believe, just do everything in us at one time, because why? We have a whole lifetime left to live. So he wants to walk through us through this lifetime of process and continue to just teach us. If it were just like, I need God and we're going to do that, now we're done, and what kind of a relationship is that? God wants to walk us and just continue to work things out on us. So wherever you are, if you have to back up or return to one of these previous steps and do things differently, that's okay. We all do it. So God, thank you for loving us. Thank you for this time together. Thank you that you're an awesome God. Thank you that you nudge us along the way to go back and make amends with your other children or people that we have harmed along the way. I pray for all of us, Lord, when we struggle with how do I do that, how do I go about that, that you would present those opportunities, Lord, that we can do that healthy fashions, and that we wouldn't bring more harm, that you would give us a sense of caution whenever we should wait, and that you would give us that burst of courage, knowing that in that moment you said, I can do all things through Christ, and we're not, that in our weaknesses of not wanting to do it, that you can make us strong. And so help us, Lord, as we struggle with saying that hardest word, I'm sorry, to know that you will walk us through this process. And we love you so much, and we thank you in the name of Jesus. Amen.